Like, how can sin through this lens easily become more powerful than God's goodness, holiness, and love? And how then does it threaten our faith?
Okay, so let's try this way. Paul, can you set this one up in terms of the psychological structures of disgust logic, and then I'll do the theological turn on it.
No, that sounds good. Tee you up here, Billy. I'll tee you up.
I was saying, I'm warming up here.
Have you ever recoiled from something totally harmless and thought, why am I freaking out over this? Congratulations, you're human. Our brains are obsessed with boundaries, inside versus outside, clean versus dirty, pure versus contaminated. And apparently, some people, ideas, behaviors are more contaminating than a drop of water on a kitchen counter, or a sneeze to the face. Humans love feeling morally superior, policing boundaries, and judging everyone who dares cross them. Religion, culture, gender norms, all excellent tools for keeping us scared, shamed, or just plain disgusted. But what if that fear, that recoil, isn't necessarily bad? What if the very things that make us squirm are exactly what shape us? I am Mark Flower, and today we're talking with siblings Billie Hoard and Paul Hoard, authors of their book Eucontamination, about disgust, the ego, purity, moral superiority, and how contamination isn't necessarily all bad. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us. I'm excited.
Now, Billie, you are a trans woman, a high school history teacher, an author and something of an Anabaptist radical, a consumerate generalist. You hold an MA in liberal arts from St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. And you write on topics ranging from fairy tales and C.S. Lewis to theology and philosophy. You and your brother, Paul, are the authors of Eucontamination, of course, what I just mentioned here. And then, Paul, I'll get to you in just a moment. But Billie, is there anything else to introduce you, or does that pretty much sum it up?
I think that covers a lot of it. Yeah, history teacher, English teacher sometimes, and I like writing.
Right on. Of course, Paul, your sibling, is a licensed counselor, psychoanalytic psychotherapist, and associate professor of counseling psychology at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, as well as a board member for the Center of Christianity and Psychoanalysis. Your scholarship focuses on Lacanian psychoanalytic theory. Sorry, a lot of big words here. Sexuality. White body supremacy, perpetration, induced trauma stress. I'm trying to get through all this. And the theological logic of disgust. You were spoken on, published internationally on topics including purity culture, trauma, eucontamination, and the intersections of theology and big words, psychoanalysis. In addition to your academic and clinical work, is a co-founder and chief strategy officer of PraxPlay, an AI-powered training platform designed to help counseling students develop clinical skill through simulated client interactions. You are the author, of course, with your sibling, of the book Eucontamination, and that's what all we're going to be talking. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to that big, long intro for that?
I'm a huge board game nerd. That often comes up at some point. So I will
I love that.
probably bring that in some way. I have a hard time not talking about it. So
I got to say, because I think you guys have participated in some of the board game play over at Theology Beer Camp. And that's where we first met, was Theology Beer Camp. And I think you guys have jumped into like board game play, haven't you guys?
I think a little bit. I know I've watched it with I don't very often bring like a bunch of Magic decks, which I think is what a lot of those were at Theology Beer Camp. But like I was recently published an article for the Board Game Academics. I just like to acknowledge that they exist. There is a group called Board Game Academics, and they have a peer-reviewed journal, and I'm very proud to have been published in there. So,
right on. That's amazing. So in order to jump into this conversation, I thought a fun little thing, because a little game to play is like a rapid fire. I'll ask you guys a statement, and then you guys can tell me on a scale of 1 to 10 how disgusted by it you are. Since we're going to be talking about disgust, eucontamination, which we will get into what that word means, what you guys coined it to be, and everything, I thought this would be kind of a fun little thing to do. So like I said, this will just be a rapid fire game. I have like 6 statements, and you guys can just say like between 1 and 10, 1 being not disgusting at all, and number 10, it means absolutely disgusting. I'm just disgusted by it. And you can interpret it, your disgust factor, however you guys want to with these. But yeah, we can get into this. So number 1 is shaking someone's hand.
1.
That's not disgusting at all.
So I thought I'd throw a little easy one in there. We'll progressively get a little bit more in here. So number 2, you step on something wet while wearing socks.
It's about a 3 for me.
I'd put it about a 2.
Okay, still pretty low, still pretty low. You look in the mirror and it's not you looking back.
1, that's a different thing for me.
That's what I was saying. So the first 2 were more of like a physical disgust. This one is kind of more of a different kind of disgust that you could possibly look at.
Yeah.
A 4 or 5 for me is my first.
Okay.
Not thinking about it.
Number 4, a stranger gives you an opinion that contradicts a foundational truth that you hold.
I actually put that down to a 2 or 3, personally.
Yeah.
Really?
For
Okay.
me, that's at a 1 or 2.
Okay.
Yeah,
For me, it'd always be a little bit higher.
No, I think this is one of those ones that people are really varied on.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, it depends on who you ask. Number 5, you surprise a loved one with a hug from behind, but then you realize that they are not the person you thought it was. And they happen to be wearing a t-shirt that says, "I love picking my nose."
We're going to go a little bit higher, probably more like a 6 for me on that one.
Yeah, I'm probably in the
Right on. And the last one, number 6. You're offered purified, clean drinking water in a brand new, straight out of the box, unused bedpan.
That probably hits around a 5 or 6 for me. And there'd be stuff happening internally. I'd be simultaneously like amused and delighted, and also like I would have a visceral disgust reaction. Like that would definitely also be present, and I'd be noticing that. And yeah.
Yeah, probably about a 6 as well.
Right on. Yeah, I don't know if I could even do it. It's new, but it's like, it's that thought of like, what are bedpans used for? So yeah, that's a tough one.
The associations. I think one of the impacts of studying and writing about disgust all the time is that you have a tendency to spend a lot of time thinking about it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a level of our own disgust tolerance, I'd say, that Billie and I have had to just engage with.
Yep.
I could see that, yeah. So I'm going to jump into this first little question here. And so this first one is about disgust and morality, of course. So I want to start this conversation with an idea that you started your book off. And it's a story of a father baking just a little bit of dog poop into some brownies in order to set an example to his children about being careful what we consume, which ultimately is a story masked as sin, but is really about leveraging disgust sensitivity as a powerful tool to enforce behavior and shape values. Disgust is such a strange emotion because it's physical, emotional, moral, and cultural all at the same time. Something that can be disgusting in one culture and normal in another, and sometimes what disgusts us say more about us than the thing itself. In your work, how do you define disgust, and why do you think it plays such a powerful role in how humans organize morality and social boundaries?
This is such a Paul question.
Okay, I'll jump in with this one.
Sorry, it was a very loaded question. Sorry about that.
That's a terrific question. It's just a very Paul question.
It's also it's fun. So Billie, I'll let you jump in at any point. So disgust is it's one of these emotions that helps us differentiate what's in and what's out, what can be me and what can't be me. So disgust is that sort of visceral bodily response that alerts you to, hey, there's something that's threatening contamination, that's threatening to upset me. So disgust is visceral, it's in your body, it's quite energizing often, actually it gives you like a physical shot, and it helps bring, the way I describe it is it helps bring clarity in the face of ambiguity. So when something could potentially be internalized, be metabolized as me, but I'm not sure that I want it to, or I sense that there could be a threat, disgust is what helps bring, no, that's gross, keep that away. It doesn't enter into it prevents that sort of well, maybe let's think about it. No, when you're disgusted by something, the facial expression is to vomit, is to spit that out. And there's, obviously when we get down to like neurobiology and sort of these other aspects around psychology, like a lot of things get debated as to sort of like to what extent is it nature, what extent is it nurture, and so we're not going to bother with that as much. But to say that it does form us not just physically, but it forms us psychologically. So disgust is what helps us differentiate what can become me, both like as an organism, me as like a psychic entity of who I think I am, how I think of myself, the Paul I imagine to be, and then also me as part of the groups that I inhabit, part of my group identity, so as the we. And so disgust is what is right there at the boundary between those. And what's really interesting is then disgust is also always tied to, is the flip side of purity. So if something's disgusting, that means we have some fantasy about something being pure. And if we imagine something to be pure, that means we're also connected to something that could threaten that purity, to contaminate it with disgust. So disgust is this kind of boundary. And again, I've often used more recently I've been using the Seinfeld quote, sort of joke about how hair on one hand, when it's on somebody's head, we often think of it as beautiful and it's nice, and sometimes it's lovely if you have a good relationship and someone's okay with it, you don't have to touch hair. But as soon as hair leaves somebody's head, ew, I don't want it anywhere. Suddenly it becomes gross. Nothing about the physical properties of the hair have changed, but its relationship to the person. What does it mean? It changes. So when hair leaves my head, now it's this ambiguous. Is that hair still me? Or is it not me? And disgust clarifies, nope, that's not you anymore. And the same thing happens with the saliva in our mouths, right? When I drink, I'm swallowing my own saliva. As soon as I spit it out, even if it was into a sterile cup, ew, get that away from me. It's not me anymore. So disgust is this emotional response to that ambiguity of what can be me, what can't be me. And we see that, like you mentioned, kind of morally, we see it psychologically, we see it sociologically, in the sense of who's us, who's not us. And so I think part of why that becomes so important is that when you have an identity, when you have a sense of this is who I am in the world, disgust is part of how that identity is created. So it gets to the very heart of how we imagine ourselves to be, who we imagine ourselves to be in the world, of what am I? That angsty question of who am I? That's actually, disgust is all wrapped up in that. So when we're dealing with disgust, we're also dealing with identity, we're dealing with our sense of self, and we're getting to some of the again, I get nervous about the word core because of my own analytic background, but some of the kind of core concepts that have constructed our sense of self in the world. That's where my mind took that question.
I don't have anything to add. That was great. Paul did a good job. He's been doing this for a minute. I trust him, and he definitely pulled it off there.
Yeah, definitely.
The side I didn't hit as much on, which is also it's just how much that also happens on group levels.
Oh yeah.
That sociologically, that happens well. And this is one of the things I found really helpful is that taking the metaphor, and it really is kind of metaphorical because it happens on associative lines, but what's poison? Right? It's that omnivore's dilemma. As humans, we can eat almost anything, but some things are poison. Mm-hmm. Disgust helps differentiate that, right? What's going to kill me, what's not. That same sort of way of thinking operates, again, on those multiple layers, including, and this is when a lot of our work has come, on this sociological level of who's us. Yeah. A large part of more contemporary psychological thought in the West, and I identify this in the West because it's existed in a lot of other cultures for a long time, has been this sort of dawning awareness that, hey, we aren't simply individuals, we are all collectively connected. So part of who I think I am is connected to who we think we are, and that the groups that we associate with and are connected to shape who we are. And so who gets to be in that group, what that group looks like, the boundaries of that group are also protected and enforced and maintained via disgust. Just like the boundaries of my own skin, the boundaries of what I'll take into my mouth, the boundaries of what I will accept when I think about who I am and what kind of a human I am. And so, yeah, that's just the other part I'd want to label, that we so often, when I'm talking to particularly kind of American audiences, we individualize it. And it's really important to recognize disgust is operant on this group level as well.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like a tribalism of one within the tribalism of all. I really like that you brought up the sterile cup example, because that was one of the big examples that you guys put, or you both put in the beginning of the book, was talking about the sterile cup and spitting into a sterile cup, and then immediately from leaving your mouth, it's disgusting. Now, if you could further extrapolate, you further talk about being pre-rational with your disgust before you're actually disgusted with it. Could you guys maybe go into that a little bit more?
Billy, you want to say anything on this, since I just talked a bit?
You did a bunch, though. I do want you to take some of this one, because I think we are still largely in the psychological realm. I will say that, yes, I should confirm, it is largely pre-rational. Disgust is something that, and Paul, jump in and correct me here, but disgust tends to jump in and do its thing well before we think about it, right? You have a disgust reaction before you decide you ought to have a disgust reaction. And then you tell yourself a story about why you were right to have the disgust reaction. And it's notable that we almost always tell ourselves a story that we were right. We very rarely tell ourselves a story about why we were wrong, or why we had an overly sensitive disgust reaction, why we didn't need to be disgusted. Usually it's, here's why that disgust reaction was justified. Even if we come to the conclusion that it's not rational. You were doing the bedpan, the sterile bedpan example, right? So it's really interesting that if I can, one imagines going through that, and it's sort of a fun prank to play or somebody. You can let somebody watch you unwrap this perfectly sterile bedpan. You could do whatever you want to demonstrate its sterility. and then have them immediately get revulsed, even if they just watch you drink water out of it, right? And then you like take one out and ask them to do it, and they're gonna be repulsed. A lot of people are gonna have this disgust reaction, and they will probably then spend the next while explaining to themselves and to anybody who will listen why they were right to be disgusted, even if you point out why logically that makes no sense. It is literally just a container. It has been demonstrated to be sterile, right? But you're going to get a lot of language along the lines of like, well, it's just gross to do that. Like, we associate that with urination. You shouldn't cross those associations, right? People will be making up a story about why they were right to have a disgust reaction, rather than making up a story explaining why it might be reasonable or it might be sort of natural or unsurprising that they did have a disgust reaction, even though it's irrational. And that might actually, you know, ideally that should be driving us to be thinking through our disgust reactions and noticing that our disgust reactions are not always founded in a legitimate fear of something that will cause us to become something we genuinely don't want to become.
Yeah, yeah, most people, I never thought about this idea of thinking about your disgust before you're actually disgusted with something until I read your book, and it was mind-blowing to me. And there's a lot of things in the book that were mind-blowing to me, but that was definitely one of them. So yeah, thank you both for sharing, like, you know, blowing my mind and expanding my knowledge a little bit about the psychoanalytic world and everything like that.
It's one of those things that is, like, it's easy to hear and then not, and then like you have to, if you sit with it for a bit, you're like, oh my goodness, that actually changes a lot of things. Because I mean, even part of where we came to it was convincing somebody logically that something isn't disgusting, doesn't or isn't a threat, does not change their disgust reaction. Right? Knowing how sterile the bedpan is doesn't by itself lower things, because it's dealing with the wrong part of it. Right? You're dealing with the tail and not the dog that's wagging it. And so some of this is really important, and comes from my own work as a therapist, where having somebody think the right thoughts or like change the way they think about something is helpful. Not to say that that's bad, but that doesn't necessarily change their anxiety, that doesn't change their depression, that doesn't change their disgust, that doesn't change their affective response to something. Because a lot of times that's happening prior to the story you're telling yourself about it. And what often happens when we simply convince ourselves, you're right, I shouldn't be disgusted by it, yet I still am, what we end up doing actually is just increasing shame. Now I'm simply not able to live into what I wish I were, and actually that causes more problems down the line. So if we don't slow down and recognize what's happening affectively in ourselves and tell a more honest story of like, oh yeah, the story I'm telling myself is going to be post hoc, and I first need to recognize what's happening in my body, then we actually often increase our own like our own symptoms, our own kind of some of the negative reactions to it, even in like a good faith attempt to make changes. When we start with thinking, we've reduced ourselves to think, we miss that actually like our bodies are so much more important, are so much more significant when it comes to how we understand and experience the world.
Yep. So most people understand contamination as something, of course, bad, like, you know, germs, pollution, moral corruption. But your concept, of course, as we've been discussing, flips that idea on its head. The idea that contamination can be positive or meaningful is really interesting and a little unsettling sometimes. Could you both explain what you mean by eucontamination and how something being contaminated might actually be good or transformative?
Yeah, I'll jump in a little bit with some of the staying on the run with psychology here for a second.
Yeah,
I'm going to let Billie say a little bit more. So that word that you've used a few times, it's probably good here to define it. Eucontamination is the title of our book, which stands for, which is the U is the EU, which is the Greek prefix for good, a good contamination. And it's because we're kind of Tolkien nerds, so we're riffing off Tolkien using it, eucatastrophe, which is sort of that moment in the fairy tale when all hope is lost, but is actually the moment of where actually everything works, where the good side wins. And so we're playing with this, and we wanted to keep the word contamination in there for exactly the reason you just described, which is contamination has all these negative connotations. Like, it generally we associate it with bad. You don't want things to be contaminated. And part of the reason for that, instead of kind of coming up with a word that would sort of perk you to think of like something that's good, is recognizing that a lot of the things that are actually going to heal you or are going to be helpful or move you towards health, you're going to resist. That we're actually going to fight against, like we're going to be defended against. That like the very thing that's going to heal us is oftentimes the things we've been resisting so much. And I'm going to say some things about therapy, and I'll say these like, again, from 10,000 foot view, so please don't hear this in any way contradicting anybody's individual work with your individual therapist, because that's going to be way more nuanced and complex and beautiful than what I'm going to say here. But I'm going to talk from 10,000 feet, so hear that caveat. But a lot of therapy, right? A lot of therapy is helping somebody face a truth, face a reality that they have been resisting. Whether that be through kind of being able to tell a more full story of trauma they've been through, being able to experience more of the identity of who they really are that feels threatening to who they wish they were, being able to understand their family and their history in a way that is a more honest reflection of reality and is sort of in conflict with who they think they're supposed to be. And it's actually when we let go of who we think we're supposed to be to allow for who we truly are, that something fascinating happens in that who we're supposed to be, actually we realize, oh, I'm not that person anyway, and that shifts. And the thing I thought was going to threaten it, kill it, destroy it, ruin it, contaminate it, that's often not the threat that I felt it to be. And so what our work really has done, and this kind of goes back to that, what we were talking about just a moment ago, is that disgust is actually much less about the object of disgust, what you think is gross, and is much more about what that thing means in relation to me. And so it's much more about me and my relationship to it than it is about that thing. So, sort of like why broccoli with a toddler isn't really about the broccoli, it's about the toddler, it's what the broccoli means to the toddler in that moment. And so even psychologically, a whole lot of therapy, not all of it, it's much bigger than this, but a lot of psychotherapy or counseling is a form of integration, learning to integrate parts of ourselves, aspects of our experience, parts of who we are into our sense of self, because who we are has never been the full story. We are so much more nuanced and complex and beautiful and diverse and strange and incoherent than we think we're supposed to be. We're given an identity and we think I'm supposed to be Paul, I'm supposed to be an Enneagram this, a Myers-Briggs that, I'm supposed to be this kind of job and this kind of thing. And we create this image of who we think we're supposed to be. And then disgust defends that against reality. And so much of healing is actually bringing in to say, no, actually, Paul, sometimes a part of you is a jerk. And when you can face that a part of you is a jerk, then that actually changes that part of you. And we can listen to why are you being a jerk in this moment and what might that tell you about who you are and how you're defending this image of yourself to hurt other people. I'm going a little bit far in there, but does that kind of make sense a little bit of where it was hitting with there?
Yeah, that definitely does make sense. I'm just going to stop right here. It looks like Billie got off.
And
so I'm back now.
Get her back in here.
I am back.
Billie? Are you back?
There she is.
I am, and I sent an urgent message to my family asking everybody else to get off of devices for right now so that they're not streaming on the internet that I'm also using to record this.
Let's see. It says everyone's recording. Cool. Yeah, Paul just finished his thought while you were out, so I think it was good that you kept talking like that. Way I can just make everything work in the post on this.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Billie, did you have any more?
I just needed to fill it with words.
You were doing a good job.
Yeah.
I heard most of, I think, what you said, because I wasn't off that long from my end, and there was only a very brief gap. So I'm with you on this one.
I want to give you a chance if you wanted to, chime in at all on that question at all.
In terms of, yes, sorry, old discombobulated, getting back in. Here we go. So I just want to put an emphasis on it, and I really like that Paul was drawing out that the thing is that change, that the kinds of change that come to us from integrating things coming in from the outside or things that we recognize about ourselves that we had hitherto not been willing to recognize, that's growth. That's what being alive is. This is kind of some of the points that we hit a little bit later on in the book, is that growth and life come from being willing to change. And if you've decided all that, if that's all sort of preordained by you, well, that's pre-selected, that's advanced. It's not even really change or growth. That's just kind of continuation along a preordained spectrum. And so there's this tension that's created where a perfect resistance to contamination, a perfect fidelity to purity, to use it, purity is the opposite of contamination, ends up being, somewhat ironically, a fidelity to death, right? A fidelity to just being static, concrete, stone, right? To be beings that grow and change means having to overcome some degree of disgust-based resistance to the introduction of outside forces and dynamics and ideas and people and all the rest into ourselves, right? If you can imagine that, disgust gone very far, even at just the biological level, right? If it went too far, you would all of a sudden, you would find yourself disgusted by all foods, because everything you take into yourself as food is not you already and is going to change you. In fact, is going to become your body. And if you were sort of perfectly disgusted, if you will, you would reach a place where you were unable to eat. And that is what we call, I mean, I'm not the professional psychotherapist, so, you know, if my terminology is wrong, Paul, please correct me. As lay people, I think what we call that is bad. That's not healthy. That's not good. So anyway, yeah. So some degree of contamination is just absolutely necessary, beautiful, wonderful, and essential to growth.
I think that's such a good way of looking at it. Like, you have to have contamination in your life. Even though we have this preconceived notion that all contamination is disgusting and bad and pollutant, you need to have the contamination in life, like you said, if you over apply it. And that goes into something else I want to cover is, out of all these illustrations that you guys put in your book, like all these things that we've already discussed, the topic of over applying the disgust logic. And I think you guys touch on something really good in talking about religion. You know, when you get the logic of disgust and is applied to holiness, sinfulness, and the nature of God, and the nature of humanity as well, like, how can sin through this lens easily become more powerful than God's goodness, holiness, and love? And how then does it threaten our faith?
Okay, so let's try this way. Paul, can you set this one up in terms of the psychological like structures of disgust logic, and then I'll do the theological turn on it.
Yeah. No, that sounds good. Tee you up here, Billy. I'll tee you up.
I'm warming up here.
So one of the things I didn't mention about disgust is that what we talk a lot about is the logic of disgust. And there's this concept called dose insensitivity, where when something's disgusting, we've been using this word contaminant. It's also like it's a pollutant. It spreads. And so what dose insensitivity means is that it actually works on a binary. It's not a question of, well, how much of the gross thing is there? It's, is there any of it? So, you know, if I have my coffee here and I find out that I hear that somebody has spat in my coffee, I don't ask the question, well, how much? The very thought that there's spit in my coffee is enough to be like, and I'll just get another cup, thank you very much. So what that means is that when disgust is operating, the thing that has all of the potency is actually the contaminant. And that the pure thing, the drinking water, the coffee, whatever it is, that's actually really fragile. It's only pure because of a negation, because the bad things are out. That makes it pure, which means it's really fragile. Any hint of a little bit of bad in there ruins the whole coffee cup. You know, and we can expand that out. If there's a swimming pool and you find out somebody peed in it, you don't typically care how much. It's like, let's go to a different pool now, or like, we're done. And importantly, the inverse doesn't work. Right? A little bit of pure water into a cup of, saliva doesn't suddenly purify the saliva and make it drinkable. The pure is always fragile in relationship to the robust, is kind of the words we've been, how robust the contaminant is. With that said, Billy, where would you like to take it away? This
so we've done this thing. Here's my turn. So now we've done this thing in the church historically where there are these purity metaphors in the Bible where purity is associated with like holiness, goodness, love, the attributes of God, virtue, and then sin ends up being associated with contamination. And there is some language for that in the Bible. There are places that, like, I think we could argue that is structurally sound and makes sense. But there's this problem where, and I think this is actually a chronic problem of historic Christian scholarship, to be honest, like a theological problem, where we'll take a metaphor in the Bible and then we will over-apply it. We'll run too far with it. And there are certain metaphors the Bible uses where it's sort of obvious that, like, it's ridiculous to push this too far. You know, I always said, like, I think in the book we say, you know, we call Jesus the Lamb of God, but nobody ever suggested that we should be making sweaters out of Jesus's hair, right? Like, there's this point that you don't push the metaphor too far, because when you do, you get to ridiculous results. But when the metaphors are a little bit more esoteric, as with, for instance, the purity metaphor, it can be harder to know when you've gone too far with the metaphor. And what we want to suggest is that if you go too hard with the purity, disgust, sin, holiness metaphor, what ends up happening is you end up in this theologically impossible but psychologically very plausible space where you start thinking of sin as more powerful than holiness, of hatred as more powerful than kindness and love, of heresy as more powerful than orthodoxy, or more powerful than truth. Right? You end up in this place, and so then you end up taking this disgust reinforced defensive posture towards your faith, towards holiness, towards your behavior, towards your community, right? Where all of a sudden you are treating what is Christ has actually said throughout the New Testament is more powerful. You're treating it as fragile, and you are treating what Christ throughout the New Testament has said very clearly is fragile, is meant to be something that we are as Christians, as people living into the truth of Christ, we're meant to be overcoming, and you treat it as like a threat and something that you need to actually protect everybody else from and protect yourself from. So you end up in this sort of, it's kind of a praxeological heresy derived, to use, now I get to use some theologian fancy words, right? But it's a kind of praxeological heresy that is derived from this over-applied, this bad hermeneutic of an over-applied purity metaphor.
Which, part of what we got there is because Jesus doesn't operate that way.
Yeah.
Jesus operates in actually as if disgust logic makes sense, but flips it and says, you're right. Dose and sensitivity is true, except guess what? I'm the contaminant.
Yeah.
I'm going to come in, and my love, touching me, will actually heal you. Loving others will transform the world. Mm-hmm. As opposed to Jesus coming in and saying, well, I'm God, so only the purest and the holiest can come get to me. It's actually, Jesus, the curtain in the temple rips. Jesus says, drink my blood, and that will heal you. People touch Jesus and are healed. He goes around actually as if he is an infection for good in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's not that this doesn't happen. It's that we actually need to invert our understanding of which side we're on.
Yeah, years and years ago when we first were researching all this, I've said before that we expected to come to this and find, like, when we come to the New Testament, we'd be like, all right, Jesus says discuss logic bad, right? Just negates it. And again, as Paul said, what we actually found was the opposite. Jesus said, instead of negating it, I like to say he inverted it. And Jesus says, no, the logic does hold, but you're misplacing the power, and you're misplacing what is the contaminant and what is the fragile pure substance. And in this case, the pure substance is actually the fallen world, is actually the spirit of sin and death. And what is the powerful contaminant for good is love, is the presence of the Spirit, is Jesus' presence.
That was so good, like defining what eucontamination is and then giving these examples like you just gave here, like you were just saying, both of you, just reshapes the entire way that I looked at the world. And I feel like anybody reading your book would just like give them a whole new perspective of how to view the world. And yeah, it's like if you follow this disgust logic, you can come to a very destructive kind of place where it does shake your entire foundation of your world. And I think a lot of people don't want to think about that because it's scary, and it can actually make you think, for one, and then it can actually uproot everything that your whole life has been based on. So, but I think it's super healthy to think about this stuff and to go these distances and have conversations with people who have given the thought. It's just the way you guys have put this, like, it's so accessible in the book too. It's not like you guys put a lot of terminology and a lot of analytic stuff in there that can go over your head easily, but you do it in contrast with a well put together, way to easily accessibly take it in as well. So you guys did a beautiful job describing all this in the book. And of course, whoever's listening to this will get a taste of it. And honestly, go buy the book. I'll just plug it right now before the end of the episode, but I know, Paul, you have to get off in a little bit, so I want to touch on Lacanianism. So maybe we could do this as maybe succinctly as possible, because I do want to touch on the question after this one. But I did want to kind of touch on Lacanianism, because you bring up Lacanianism quite a bit in the book, and I had no idea who Lacan was. So a lot of people might not be familiar with Jacques Lacan, but they might recognize the idea that we are shaped by desire, lack, and the symbolic world around us. So like I said, I had no idea about this, but he's one fascinating dude. Like once you start looking into it and like what he's all about, what he's written, it's really cool stuff. He's sometimes referred to as the French Freud. A lot of people know who Sigmund Freud is. So he was one of the most influential minds in the 20th century in psychoanalysis. So in your book, you go even further in the writings, like the idea of the ego and the mirror self. Lacanian psychology, though, can feel abstract until you apply it to everyday things like relationships, religion, and even disgust. So how does Lacanian theory help explain why humans are so obsessed with purity, contamination, and boundaries?
Okay, well, there's a lot in there, and I know we want to be quick, so I'm going to try not to go too far.
Sorry, I load my questions like crazy.
Paul loves to nerd out on exactly this subject.
Yeah, like this, I teach classes on this. Here we go. So a couple things. One, he's kind of niche in the U.S. So Lacan was not translated well into English until probably like 20 years ago or so. So psychoanalysis in the U.S. is also, it's not the biggest thing in the world, particularly in psychological communities or people who are interested in therapy. So already psychoanalytic thought, kind of niche. And then Lacan is niche within psychoanalysis. So if you've never heard of him, you're you're with most people. And some of that is because I find his writings really, really fascinating. I've had a huge impact both on me as a clinician, but also on me as a thinker and me as an educator. And one of these concepts, and I'll be real brief here, that he always comes back to, is that what it means to be conscious, what it means to be human, is to be split. You are not a fully coherent, full kind of core of yourself. This is why I was sort of bristling at my use of the word core earlier, because like a lot of American psychology goes down to like, what's your core self? What's the real you? And like, what's your true self versus what's your false self? And this sense of like, let's get down to like, when you finally get down to like, there is some kernel of who you are. Lacan actually argues, when we get down to the kernel of who you are, you're split. That what it means to be human is actually to be in paradox, to be in contradiction, and that's actually generative and that's beautiful. But in order to survive that, in order to have coherence in there, we create an image of who we think we're supposed to be. And this image, and you mentioned that sort of mirror self, is our ego. It's how we look to the important, significant individuals in our lives when we're young. So when a parent looks at a child and goes, "Oh, aren't you a beautiful baby?" We're experiencing ourselves through the eyes of somebody else. And that's wonderful, but it's never the full picture. What this means for contamination means our sense of who we think we are has always required us to push out, foreclose on certain aspects of us. So to get closer to a deeper reality of who we are, we always need to be open to the contamination of the things that were cut out, the things we like didn't fit into the image of ourselves. Actually, those are always pushing in. And when we can be open to that, that allows us to continually be in a position of transforming and of learning and of growing and of experiencing more. And actually, that's where vitality comes from. There's a whole other thing about like where life and enjoyment versus desire I get into in the book, but we don't need to have time to get into here. But the short of it is that in Lacanian theory, because we are split, there's always more to us. We can never tell a complete story, and that is beautiful because we can continually grow into who we are. And who we are is more of a becoming than an are. It's not like a point where you accept and then you just buckle down and like, oh, this is it. Because you don't never arrive, you continue to move towards and explore and grow. And that I find really inspiring. And I get into quite a bit in the book, but that's sort of where I'd go with it.
No, I think that's a beautiful nutshell right there. Yeah, there's so much to it. I mean, you gave just literally just a snippet of everything that he writes and everything like that in his books. And I've only done just a snippet of research on him too. But yeah, if anybody's interested, he's super fascinating. And, Paul can talk for days probably about this kind of stuff. But yeah, but I did want to get into this next part here. I think this next question is very important, especially within Disgust as well. So a common prevailing narrative is that when it comes to people we tend to other, like in case of immigrants, there are various ethnic groups like we've been seeing over the past year and a half, is that certain tribalistic groups fear the other because they don't understand them, and that's why the other becomes a contaminant that must be removed. The reaction seems to show up in a lot of conversations about trans bodies and gender nonconformity as well. Purity culture often creates a very rigid category for bodies, gender roles, and sexuality, where everything has to fit neatly into pure categories. People who are trans, by their very existence, blur categories and boundaries, which seem to like exactly the kind of thing that triggers contamination anxiety. And Billie, I think this would be right up your wheelhouse. You'd probably be able to talk quite a bit on this subject. Do you think that some of the backlash against trans people is less about theology or biology and more about people feeling like categories are being contaminated or boundaries are being dissolved?
I absolutely do. Thank you for asking. Okay, now I'm going to try not to like go on and on and on and on and on and on. Because this is definitely another area of like my own scholarship that I get into a lot. There is a phenomenon that I have noticed and participated in, like heavily participated in, where queer Christians particularly, and I'm going to sort of speak to the queer Christian world and the dynamic there, because I think it exemplifies at a sort of smaller level what is actually also true at a larger level in our society, which is patriarchally shaped and so forth. And that is that like there's a moment where, you know, queer Christian folks are starting to come out, and you're kind of making peace with like your queerness, and you're like, actually I think God does love me, and that's neat. And you get like very, I'm going to use the term like evangelical about it. Like I have literally, you can go to my Substack and read like a whole blog series I wrote about like why God is cool with gay people, and another one about why God is cool with trans people, and like why this is actually very compatible. What actually surprises me about that, and that's just really common, like a lot of us do it, and what actually surprises me about that is that like the arguments aren't even that hard to make. They're pretty straightforward. I think they're very, very compelling, and everybody then runs into a kind of dismay. Everybody who does this runs into a sort of dismay where they also tend not to be very well accepted, and like they are these like really strong arguments are way less effective than you would think. And you start to have to figure out why. And then this is where you start to run into disgust as having a lot of strong explanatory power, because what you don't realize when you're like young and naive and excited to tell the whole world about why like actually there's more freedom in Christ than we thought there was, and isn't that beautiful and wonderful, and shouldn't we all be happy? What you don't realize is the degree to which you are violating a disgust boundary, and that disgust is policing your audience's capacity to hear, entertain, or process anything you have to say. Like you think reason will work. Reason is not the major operating thing, right? Like it's, to somebody who like me, who's both queer and Christian and kind of an academic and kind of a nerd, it was really frustrating to realize that it is just true that like knowing and being friends with a queer person, a queer Christian person, is far more likely to result in a person becoming theologically affirming than reading a really good, compelling book about why God affirms queer identities and gay marriage or whatever. But it's the case, right? It just is the case that those relationships are the thing that make the difference, right? The most reliably, predictably affirming straight Christians are like the parents of gay kids. All right, like those, not always, right? Like there are a lot of really terrible, non-affirming parents of gay kids, and there's a lot of tragedy that has come from that. But like that's sort of like the biggest, like when you realize this person I love is gay, you're immediately confronted with, I can be disgusted by this or not, or like I have a disgust reaction, but I don't want to have a disgust reaction towards my kid. And then you're confronted by it directly, and the relationship does a lot of this work to overcome disgust, because relationships, and we didn't get into this as much in our conversation today, but relationship intimacy is far more effective in overcoming a disgust reaction than anything related to our reason, our capacity to think, our capacity to like make logical deductions and inductive and inference and all the rest of that. So put all of that, like that, just observationally, it just sort of seems to be the case that disgust has a lot more explanatory power as like providing the impetus for the rejection of and resistance to affirmation than anything else that I've found. And at the same time, you're right and absolutely in the question, and you called out that like trans people, but also just like cis queer people across the board, I very much want to be very clear, I'm including like our ace siblings here as well. They screw with our easy categories, and we want our easy categories. We want also to be made to feel safe in the categories that we already feel that we inhabit, right? Like, so take a cishet man who has had his masculinity questioned. The default approach generally seems to be to try to like figure out, how does my culture define masculinity, and how do I live into that in a way that will cause nobody else to ever again question my masculinity, rather than to say, well, I am who I am, and like this is the way I like to express myself, and either that can put me slightly outside the boundary of the masculinity definition or the man definition, and that's fine, and I know I'm a man, and so therefore like we actually just need to reimagine our boundaries. Both of those latter options would be, I would argue, healthier, more empowered, more robust. But the one that is almost inevitably chosen, the let me try to conform myself more to stereotypically acculturated definitions of masculinity, is the more fragile one, but it's also the more disgust-formed one, right? It is the one that says, I have to be afraid of anything, even in myself, that would put me outside of this neat category. We don't love questioning the categories or the firmness or the reality of the walls that define those categories. We would much rather, ironically, change ourselves, force ourselves into boxes, cut off a part of ourselves so that we can feel safe within those boundaries. And trans people, just by existing, challenge the existence and the reality of those walls, because they are made up walls. It's not bad to make up the walls. Again, Paul, not at a fundamental level. I think we have overly reified them and done a lot of damage to ourselves in the process. Right. But like the idea of categories is just how we think. And Paul has done some really good work around like identity formation and the necessity of identity formation. But when we start to mistake these like cultural, conventional, psychologically developed categories that are used in order to help us think through the world, and we start mistaking those for like fundamental reality, like the nature of the real, we end up getting into a lot of trouble, and we end up causing a lot of damage, and we end up enacting violence against those whose simple existence puts us into a place of sort of, you know, cognitive dissonance between what I have to believe must be real and what I am observing in front of me in this other person. And that is making me very uncomfortable, and I'm going to go do violence about it. So I think a lot of the queer phobia that we see, I think a lot of the expulsion of queer Christians from Christian spaces is all a manifestation of this boundary reifying disgust reaction. These are people clinging to disgust. The example we share in the book that I think really is just kind of the pinnacle of this was the Gospel Coalition article, where you had a Gospel Coalition author just straight up arguing to people, your disgust reaction is good. It is protecting you from queerness. You should reinforce your disgust reaction when you encounter queer people. Mm-hmm. You should not try to overcome it. Because people know that having a queer disgust reaction to other people is kind of antisocial. Right, is the opposite of like a pro-social reaction to other human beings, and so so he felt like he had to overcome that counterbalance where people would feel guilty about feeling grossed out by a gay wedding or, you know, gay people holding hands, and he's like, no, your disgust reaction is good because it's protecting your reified boundary set that you see as that in his voice that we see as necessary to being Christian or to the quote Christian worldview or whatever. And it was again, he's straight up just sort of acknowledging that disgust is a very powerful boundary reinforcement mechanism, and then he's saying these boundaries there are really important. So actually reinforcing disgust in this area is good and healthy. And he was of course dead wrong, but I think he was doing us all a service in as much as he was putting on full display the degree to which this sort of anti-queer bias within Christian history and Christian theology, and especially conservative Christian circles, depends on disgust as a mechanism to keep itself in power.
Yeah, and I think you touched on something really important, that it gives you a whole new perspective on what the Bible talks about as freedom, you know, with this whole protecting yourself and kind of closing yourself off to. I mean, my introduction and my ultimate, you know, conversion into being, you know, queer affirming and everything was my evangelical university, where I saw my queer fellow classmates be let go from school or kicked out of school because they were gay, because they were found out, like they're hiding their true identity from the faculty and everyone else there. And then when it came out, I saw left and right my classmates were let go from school and not allowed to come back just because they were queer. So I think, and understanding of who they were, I think getting to know them, they were beautiful people. And it's like, why would they be let go from school just because of who they are? So it's crazy.
And if I can, I'm gonna take 3 seconds and I want to use the little soapbox here, because this is the sermon I like to preach to all of my queer siblings. Let me just jump in here,
Paul. If you do need to jump off, you can jump off anytime. But yeah, go ahead.
Because this is the thing. I really want every queer person to hear this part, right? Like, this is so beautiful to me. They will treat you as disgusting because you are more powerful. Like, this is why it is so important to me at like a personal level to build this theology of eucontamination. It's because what we are is good, and at some level they sense that their queer phobia is threatened by just our presence, right? Like, even just seeing us, like the fact of relationship with us is a wild threat, right? This is why Christian universities like that have to get rid of, have to expel, have to kick off campus queer Christians, because if cishet allosexual Christians see the fidelity with which we live out the Christian life, this is when Paul says, let them see your good works that they may glorify God on the day that he visits us, right? The threat to these institutions is that the people in those institutions will see our good works and glorify God on the day that he visits us. And that would cause them to be affirming. And they know that just relationship is going to change a number of people. It's going to overcome that disgust reaction, and they can't have that. They can't afford that. So again, like, it is, I would argue, a literal expulsive disgust reaction. Like, this is at the institutional level, a vomiting out of queer people has become standard practice. If you find out that there is somebody who is by all other categories a member in good standing of the community, and they're queer, the institution has to vomit them out because they are a threat to that institution's identity as non-affirming. And of course, being non-affirming is fundamental to that institution's identity as getting money from conservative groups that fund those institutions.
Mm-hmm. Well, why don't we wrap this up? I know, Paul, you have to jump off, and I want to give you guys a chance to. I had one last question, and you guys can answer if you want to, maybe with everything else here. But if someone reads your book and walks away remembering only one idea, one thing that changes how they see the world, what do you hope that idea is? And I also want to give you guys a chance to, if anybody wants to find you or find your book, maybe you guys could share in that a little bit.
Paul, go first.
Yeah, well, I'd say, one, what Billie just said is probably one of the things that I hope people take away from that, is that, I think if there's one thing they take away from us is the beautiful disruption that is love, mm-hmm. and that I think that is Jesus, and I think to live into that. The question I often ask in my classes and when I'm speaking is, I love this question of just, well, what if there's more? And when that question is a beautiful invitation and exciting, sometimes disturbing, but as an invitation into more, I think that's where we find Jesus. A lot of the book was inspired by, the verse, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and my own desire to continue to pursue the way, the truth, and the life of Jesus, and how that has been disturbing, it has been destabilizing, it has been enlivening, though, and I think that's where we continue if we keep searching, as opposed to circling and defending, and it's this invitation to just keep growing, to keep going, and to continue to play with what if there's more. So that would be where I would say, sort of hope that something that sticks with people as they read the book. And towards the end, we talk about the beauty and power of joy. And I think that's actually, there's a lot there that I would encourage people to go after.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. You can find the book pretty much anywhere, like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and through the publisher, Whip and Stock or Cascade Books, is sort of where we did that. Both of us are on Substack, and I publish pretty regular blogs on Lacanian psychoanalytic theory, on virtue, on board games. Right now I'm doing a series on AI. You kind of find more about that. If you're interested particularly in Lacanian psychoanalytic theory, that's a great place to begin. If some of that interested you. I'd also just love to plug that the Center for Christianity and Psychoanalysis, I will be doing a series on our book and on Lacan in the fall. And so if any of your listeners are interested in that, don't need to be analysts or therapists, but sort of anybody interested in that, we'll be doing a deeper dive into some of those intersections there.
You could run a podcast and you might be interested.
It'd be great. It's going to be really cool. All right, so yeah, I'm Billie Hoard. I am on all the socials as @Billie is writing, and that includes Substack, where I think Paul said he publishes pretty regularly. I publish pretty irregularly. I have no set schedule that I go with, and I publish all over the place. I think most of my topics are on queer Christianity, queer liberationist theology, C.S. Lewis, and sort of contemporary politics and what it means for queer people living in the contemporary fascist age that we find ourselves in. So that's kind of what I've been writing about for the last couple of years, at least. I have a really cool series that I've been working through on Lewis and gender that I just plug for everybody. It's cool, good stuff. In terms of I think I gave me a little sermon. This is the thing that I want on my queer, anybody who's queer who hears me. I want them to hear that. Again, the way I always shorthanded it the most as just your queerness is a blessing. Queerphobia is the sin. And if you suffer because of your queerness, you're not suffering because of your queerness. You're suffering because the world is queerphobic. I'm with Paul. I want to put it this way. I'm going to go very orthodox on this one. Go to Jesus. For me, it's go back to Jesus, coming back to Jesus, coming back to Jesus. Jesus says, I have overcome the world. Do not be afraid. I have overcome the world. It was Jesus who, for the joy set before him, embraced the cross, right? We're recording this right at the, just after Easter, right? And denied the shame. There is following joy into life feels like a death. And we have to embrace 1,000 small deaths of that sort as we follow joy into life, because the old you is always dying as the new you emerges and as we grow and change into we don't know yet what. And I think that is beautiful, and we need to reorient ourselves to experience that as beautiful and challenging and exciting, rather than as the threat that our disgust reaction is going to want us to believe it is.
That was beautiful. Thank you both for coming on here. You guys brought a lot of enlightenment. Just also post-reading the book, I felt like just listening to you guys talk, it just brought a lot more life to the book too as well. So thank you so much for coming on here.
Thanks,
it was a real pleasure talking to both of you.
Really appreciate you having us. Oh, and eat with people. Eat with people.
Yes. We didn't even get into the importance of eating and all of that on this podcast.
You guys did touch on that book too. I'm a food podcast. I really should have included that in here.
This topic. Like our very favorite presentations on this topic.
Maybe I'll have to talk with you guys again. Maybe you guys have Egon later this year or something. But maybe we can go into food and just go into food and dig into it. So, yeah. Well,
I do need to run here, so I'll let y'all go.
All right. Bye-bye.